It was a year-long analysis of clean energy investment in 55 countries. So we will hear about this project, and we will also learn about the landscape for clean energy in the developing countries. For the luncheon speech, we have Mr. Nathaniel Bullard, the Director of Content at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, joining us. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bullard to the stage with a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, for that kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here and taking time out from your actually quite ample lunch boxes in front of you. I had trouble myself getting through all of the food, but hopefully it's enough to keep you through my quick talk about a project called ClimateScope. My group within Bloomberg is devoted exclusively to analyzing clean energy, and we've been doing a project now for 3 years looking specifically at the landscape for clean energy and clean technology deployment in the developing world. That project is called ClimateScope. If I may take a line from Ms. Mary Robinson's discussion this morning about new economic signals in a world with the climate that we have today. The one-sentence version of ClimateScope is this is a way to translate those new economic signals into actual investment. How do they then become capital? How does that capital then become a series of projects? So let me walk you through a couple of things. First of all, just what this project looks like, because it's actually quite an undertaking, I don't mind saying. And then 2 other sections. The first is the findings from this year in the 55 countries and the additional 25 Chinese provinces and Indian states that we analyzed, and then some lessons from rather short run of history from Latin America, where we've now done the project 3 years in a row. So ClimateScope is a project, but if we think about it a bit more broadly, it's meant to do a number of things specific to clean energy investment. And they really begin from a perspective of data. When we have so many different places in the world with so many different definitions of what constitutes clean or not clean, what constitutes developing, what constitutes on-grid or off-grid, it's extremely important that we do some level setting, and that's actually what our effort does here. The ultimate goal is really to just mobilize capital and make sure that people are able to do the investments that are warranted, that are necessary within the developing world. And we do that with 4 components to our subject. First of all, it's an index, and an index obviously derives from lots and lots of numbers. You'll hear a little bit more of those numbers in just a moment. It's a report, and quite a long report, that actually summarizes these all into a takeaway for policymakers, for ministers, for investors who need a quick look at what countries look like internally and also how they compare to each other in terms of investment. A very detailed, interactive online tool to allow you not just to look at what we have derived, but to toggle that information as you want. So if you want to reweight a country more towards a value chain, more towards investment, more towards greenhouse gas management, you're able to do that. And then very importantly, it's an online and large open source data set. And that data set is what actually lets you do this level setting. It lets you compare an investment in Senegal to an investment in China. And that's something that has been proven challenging to do in the past, and hopefully our modest hope is that we're able to make that a little bit easier. We began this project in Latin America. Starting in 2012, we covered 26 Latin American and Caribbean countries, and we expanded it last year to cover a large swath of Africa, as well as 10 countries in Asia. The 10 countries in Asia include, as I said, 25 states and provinces analyzed separately within India and China. The total population analyzed in Asia is in excess of about 3.1 billion people. It's probably around half a billion perhaps in Africa, and the entirety of Latin America. We cover quite a lot of activity, and there's a number of ways to show it. One is the actual individual bits and pieces, which I can get to, but I like top lines better because they're just more compelling. It's 142 gigawatts worth of capacity that we're actually analyzing that's been installed over the past 6 years in these countries. It's more than $750 billion worth of actual investment. So when we talk about discussions about investment that speak about it as if we have to really unlock it and get it going, to a large extent, money is flowing quite a bit already. And it's 519 individual support policies that we've analyzed across these 55 countries. So not just saying there's a feed-in tariff in Argentina, but getting very specifically into how a district heating policy in one place compares to another, or how a local content rule in one country compares to another. We then group that into 4 different parameters. First is an enabling framework, and this is extremely important because the enabling framework is the one that creates the policy, the price attractiveness, the market size expectation in each of the countries. The investment in financing section is obviously right behind, and in fact, the one tends to lead to the other. If you have an attractive policy and regulatory framework and you have good capital markets, well, you tend to be able to actually have this investment. And then laterally are 2 others, the low-carbon business and the clean energy value chains, and greenhouse gas management activities. And we've actually discovered in the last couple of years quite a lot of insight derived in particular from the discussions of financing and of the low-carbon business and the value chains. How many actual things are we looking at? Well, we have put together 195 indicators across these 4 parameters. 195 indicators times 55 countries times 6 years, and we're at around 65,000 discrete data points that actually inform our analysis. I'd say that it's robust. It's a good start. When we get it to 100,000 data points, I think we'll probably be in an even better way to compare country to country. The ultimate result lives here. It's online at our site, and it's a lot of fun to explore. There's something very important about a project like this in making it accessible. So not only is it a deep dive that's useful for people who are going to be making an on-the-ground policy decision, but it's something that at the very highest levels of an organization, of a government, of a ministry, are able to be apprehensible. They're something that you can actually work with. So it's all here if you ever want to take a look. So this year, we've got a lot of insight to derive from the actual rankings that we put together. And I'll run you through what happened this year. Then I'll take a look specifically at Latin America, where we can see what happened there with a 3-year time series. And in particular, to inflect this for some lessons about green growth. It's important to note that while the OECD has quite a head start in the world of power development and in terms of cumulative installed power capacity, you'll notice that developed world countries are quite a ways ahead of developing countries. You need to look at them as a vector and not a total. So this is what the OECD's new net gigawatts of power generation capacity look like in the past 10 years. Obviously, a good deal more clean energy than fossil fuels. Nice to see a largely seamless function growing all the way until last year in the OECD. But the countries that we studied in climate scope, so just the 55 countries we've studied in climate scope, are rather different. For one thing, there's vastly more net fossil fuel capacity being added in these countries, just for a bit of context. Peaking at 126 gigawatts of fossil fuels added in 2006 is exactly 100 gigawatts more than got added in the same year in the OECD countries. And also, this clean energy function largely mirrors the one that we saw in the developed world. And I don't think this is a finding that many people are probably expecting. The functions are quite similar, but what we've noticed starting last year is that the climate scope countries are jumping ahead in terms of how much they've deployed. The other thing is to note a frame of competition. How competitive are clean energy technologies within the power markets in the countries that we've studied? Well, for about half of them, so all the way, in fact, to some of the provinces of eastern China, solar power and the industrial tariff compete. Or rather, to put it a better way, solar outcompetes. And if you include wind energy capacity, all but a very few of the countries that we've studied find wind energy more expensive than a fossil fuel option. And so how does that start to play out in terms of rankings and in terms of countries? So I pulled here the top 10 and the bottom 10 in the rankings. It's kind of impossible to show 55 points in one slide. China is the most attractive environment for clean energy investment last year, followed by Brazil, South Africa, India, and then Chile. In the countries at the bottom of the rankings, it's a number of different countries from sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Caribbean, but also parts of developing Asia as well. What's significant here is that population size does matter to some extent. It does matter that China has 1.35 billion people, but Chile, with a relatively smaller population, still manages to rank quite highly. And having a large population, relatively speaking, like in Venezuela's case, does not necessarily imply that you are the most attractive landscape for clean energy investment. If you look at them then into these each individual frameworks, it's very illuminating. So, Asian states and provinces actually dominate in the enabling framework. So all of the sets of policies that gather not only the national level, but the provinces, the provincial level and state level policies. And the reason we do this analysis is important. Brazil is the largest country we'd analyzed prior to 2014, but one state in India, Uttar Pradesh, is the same population as Brazil. So it's important to disaggregate these from their national whole. You know, the lessons we find there is that really the places where project deployment was made most attractive were the areas, countries, regions, states that ranked the highest. Enabling manufacturing definitely has a role in the enabling framework, but it tends to apply most to large countries, and I'll return to that later. But supporting deployment actually allows you to drive development into sort of the less developed parts of these large countries. So in China, Xinjiang, Qinghai, Gansu are all remote, western, relatively unpopulated areas, but ideal for large-scale projects. Chinese provinces dominate, not surprisingly, in the investment in climate finance. And again, it's a matter of project deployment. This is largely geographical. This is actually significant to note. I know that inherently, I think we all understand this, but areas where you have large land masses that you can develop wind and solar on tend to be the best places to do it. And utilizing those resources is actually the best leverage of your capital if you're viewing it purely on a cost basis. If you are going to get a higher capacity factor for that same physical project developed in a remote area, you actually get better leverage on your money. Value chains. The value chain is actually an area in which one can score perfectly. And again, it's probably not surprising that China does so. Well, China is the world's second largest economy. It's the largest power system. It's the largest carbon dioxide emitter. It's the largest manufacturer of clean energy technologies. It basically produces a quarter of all of the large inputs to an economy that you can think of, except when it produces 50% of them. So yes, China has a perfect score on the value chain. But the other thing to point out is that large countries tend to have more complete value chains, particularly because we include a lot of services in our value chain. The value chain is not simply one thing that you manufacture. The value chain also includes a lot of different materials and skill sets that go in. So things such as legal services, things such as communication services, professional engineering, things like that. And that's a place where countries, even if they're relatively smaller, can still perform very well. And we noticed that in particular with Uganda and Kenya. So these are countries that have very robust networks for developing in the off-grid. And those off-grid networks mean that these countries, relatively speaking, outperform, considering their relatively small size compared to China. And finally, on greenhouse gas management, you'll notice that really only one state or rather one province in China performs in the top 10. And the lesson there is that actually it is international engagement that matters primarily for greenhouse gas management. Again, this is probably not a surprise to many of the policymakers in the room. But this is why, in particular, Latin America has performed well. A long history of robust engagement on a policy level internationally around greenhouse gas emissions. What we're starting to see, though, is a bit of corporate engagement as well. And that corporate engagement, I think, will prove to be important in the future as more and more sort of secular reasons for deploying clean energy technologies become apparent. As I mentioned, we've now done Latin America 3 years running, so we've actually got a time series. We can start to do some analysis comparing one country to another, but also comparing countries to themselves over time. And this is extremely important for back-testing the investment climate in one country as time moves on. In 2012, Brazil was the best-ranked country for clean energy deployment in Latin America. Same again in 2013. But what's worth noting here is that we saw 5 countries in the top 10 increase their score. So they've actually improved in terms of attractiveness for investment for clean energy. And the reason that they've improved are twofold. First, we saw in some countries improvements in the value chain, in particular in Mexico, as it begins a process, slow process, but a quite massive process of liberalizing its power market. It's starting to become apparent that there's an opportunity for value chain. And a lot of green microfinance that's being deployed, in particular in places like Peru and in Chile. We go forward one more year, so from 2013 scores to this year, it's actually quite a different story. 2 countries improve their scores in the top 10. 8 countries have their numerical score decline, and it's very important to note why. Uruguay performs very well because you've got competitive tenders, probably the best price discovery mechanism for figuring out what things are going to cost in terms of clean energy deployment. So that raises its score, as well as in Costa Rica, where investment nearly tripled in the course of 1 year. But in other countries, falling overall investment impacted their scores. So despite the climate that we saw the year before, investment hadn't really been attracted in a robust manner. There's a bit of a stop-start in play, and that's important to note, because that stop-start is very challenging for deploying capital. When you have a situation where you're never sure from 1 year to the next how well your investment climate is going to be, it tends to impair the deployment of capital. And one of the goals of this project is to give us the tools to make capital deployment as seamless as possible. That's a bit of our findings, and I just want to tell you what comes next for the project, because we'll be doing it again and ideally expanding it. We revisit the methodology every year. We're right in the midst of that process right now, as well as in funding the next iteration. The U.S. Agency for International Development, the Multilateral Investment Fund of the IADB, and DFID in the UK are our funders currently, and will be returning. But we can always expand the project. As I say, we only cover 55 countries. There's a lot more to go. We start our visits, and we will be in every country. We will be visiting dozens of offices in every place that we go to collect the last year worth of data that we've got, to continue to backtest what we received previously, and obviously using what we've found, continue to expand the information network that we've been drawing in. We then start in May the actual calculation process, and this goes on for about 4 months. There's a great deal of assessment. There's presentation to our donor countries for review. We start writing the project. Come October, it's all online, and we start the whole song and dance over again. So if I could just conclude with 2 thoughts. First of all, it's quite an effort to do something like this. As I mentioned, 65,000 discrete data points covering investment take some time to collect, but they're very worthwhile because they allow us a shared ground on which to consider investment. So rather than saying, I need to deploy capital in Kenya, or I need to deploy capital in Myanmar, they say, I'm going to be deploying capital into clean technologies, and I'd like to best know where to do so. The second point to highlight is that it's iterative. We'll continue to discover more as this goes on, and we'll continue to expand it. The lessons that come from the first few years of study can go into the process of other countries' development, and they'll allow us to continue to refine our scores. The nice thing about this effort is it allows us to take things that are national, things that are policy-driven, things that are specific to finance at that time, things that are technological at that moment, and begin to levelize them, and begin to give us frameworks for understanding countries. So it's not just a country you're interested in, it's a type of country. It's not just one kind of green growth path that you want to go down, but it's distinguishing within green growth what you're most interested in and what, in fact, might be best suited for your economy. That's all from me, but I'd actually love to take a couple of questions because we've got about 12 minutes here, if anybody has some questions from the floor. All I need to know is a name and an affiliation and a question, and I'd love to hear from you. Anybody from the floor got any questions for me?
Thank you, Mr. Billard. I think we have a question way over there. Can we
have
get
one way
step?
Over there.
Yep.
Hello, Helen.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Hi, thank you very much. I'm Helen Mountford with the New Climate Economy Project and World Resources Institute. So thank you. That was fascinating and always insightful from
Thank you.
BNEF to see what the latest trends are and what's driving them. We know from the work that we've been doing and the work that you've been doing that renewables are increasingly cost competitive with fossil fuels in many, many regions, and you showed that again today. And yet, they're often not where the investments are going. Even where they're cost competitive, we're often seeing that they still go into fossil fuels. There's various barriers, there's the cost of financing, there's other ones. If you were able to convince policymakers here today or outside these walls of one or two things they could do to shift that picture, to make sure that where renewables are cost competitive, they are being chosen, what would they be?
It's a superb question, first of all. Thank you, Helen. And it is a sort of persistent challenge as much now as it was in 2004, I think, when Germany launched its feed-in tariff. And the reason Germany has managed to have such a robust market for so long is stability, right? Our experience with companies, with financiers ready to deploy capital and technology is not that they need some particularly high tariff, but they need stability. This was years ago, but it's still probably the best quote I've heard about thinking of clean technologies and a transition from fossil fuels to clean technologies, and it comes from Lord John Brown, who was at BP at the time, and he said, "We're really simply talking about replacing operating expenditure with capital. So you're talking about taking a project that used to be 15% steel and pipes and wires and 85% fuel over its lifetime, and reversing it to be 85% pipes, steel, wires, whatever it might be, and the rest operating. But in order to do that, you have to give a framework that is supportive on the timeline that people are going to be deploying capital. And that timeline, ideally, is 20 years or longer, because that's when you find your costs of debt are lowest, and that's when you find, therefore, your levelized costs lowest." I think to add one other comment, though, Helen, that's changed, I think, recently is increasingly these investments are viable at a scale that is challenging for investment capital, and that's 40 watts or 50 watts. That's a rooftop solar panel and a small LED light bulb, perhaps a small battery in the home. And in fact, we've seen in Bangladesh, for instance, 3 million individual small solar systems financed through an institution in Bangladesh. We see hundreds of thousands of them going every year all over the place, but they tend to be financed, such as it is, through a mobile phone pay-as-you-go. So they're providing quite a lot of benefit and quite a lot of growth, but aggregating that to the scale of unlocking institutional investor capital is proving to be a bit of a challenge. But I think it's possible over time, because I think it just simply takes scale and an appreciation of what's possible in order to get there. I think we have another question. Yeah?
Yes, the gentleman over there.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's very, very informative.
Thank you.
Just two things. I have been, together with my colleagues, we have been working on environmental and resources implications of renewable energy technologies. Yes. We have reviewed about 26 different technologies and provided projections to 2050 under the International Resource Panel of the United Nations Environment Program. It has been just approved, so it will be coming online very soon. I think it will be very useful in tandem with your report. My question is about the dynamic nature of the ranking that you have shown, which is very interesting. And I was wondering whether the dynamic nature itself is, in a way, defining character of the investment climate on renewable energy itself. Because, for example, my understanding was that earlier this year, Spanish government decided not to continue the feed-in tariff for renewable energy, which is dynamic in nature. At the same time, it really, aggravates the investment environment for that country.
I think aggravated is too kind a word.
Exactly.
I think it was a little bit more than aggravation, and it's actually very right that you point that out. So when we talk about policy revision and retroactively making changes, this is a very challenging structure to ask people to deploy long-term capital into. What I would say, though, is that was Spain's problem, to be very direct about it. This is an artifact of a time and place when technology costs were changing profoundly, and the regulatory frameworks to support that technology hadn't quite caught up yet. It's quite unfortunate, because it wasn't just Spain, it was also in the Czech Republic. We had it happen in Bulgaria as well. But I think price discovery is much more visible now in most of the world. In a sense, countries that are beginning this path towards clean energy and the green growth that goes with it now are actually the beneficiaries of all of these policy missteps that happened earlier. So it is a case, but we haven't seen anything that drastic in the climate scope schedule of work, so to speak. Fortunately, what we've seen is things are moving slightly slower than they were, but we haven't seen much retroactive change. Or we've seen policies that were introduced and haven't yet catalyzed the growth that they need. What that means is not that the policies are necessarily bad, but perhaps they need some tweaking. They need some optimization for the particular case that they're in. Do I have any other questions? I must have some. Yes, we have two on this side. And if you could tell me where you're from, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jihyun Lee. I'm from Korea, but I work for UN Habitat United Nations Agency in charge of the sustainable urbanization. Actually, we've been working a lot in terms of indicator for green growth or eco-city. But after a couple of years, actually, the government really want to focus actually enabling the factor, like as you show.
Yes.
And we have, we understood, but it's really difficult how to define and actually what is really could be defined as the enabling factor, because
Yes.
many times actually some regulation which looks like helping the market, but in the end actually it doesn't work. So that's one tricky question. Second, overall in your the future plan, how do you plan to improve or this kind of perspective overall analysis of your climate the scope? Thank
Certainly.
you.
So two questions. One is, how do we address the fact that some indicators, when well-meaning and launched, simply don't work? And the other is, how do we go about improving this process through iteration? The first point I would say is that the challenge from a policymaker's perspective is that they tend to enact a policy internal to their organization. You can enact a favorable feed-in tariff policy, but if you have problems with land rights and property rights, or you have an extremely high discount rate on your central bank debt, then you're going to find it difficult to deploy. And that's actually one of the reasons we put all of these together, all 195 of these separate sub-indicators together, so that you can actually measure the one against the other. You can look at a feed-in tariff and say, that is actually quite attractive, but nobody's going to do it if your central bank discount rate is 12%. So it's actually a way to actually isolate the issue, right? The issue may not be with the policy regarding clean energy or with green growth. The policy issue may lie with your central bank's discount rate. As far as improvement, well, the main improvement that comes is simply from the active iteration, right? So I'm always pleased when people say, I've got better data for you from last year, right? Our regulators didn't want to play along nicely last year, and so they didn't give you the most current prices that you have for your on-grid and your off-grid indicators. So one of the things we do is we sort of cast a lot of sunlight, and it actually encourages more participation. The other thing that's actually, I would say personally and professionally for us that we really enjoy is when people say, I'm disappointed in my ranking, what do I need to do better? And actually, in almost every case, providing more information allows us to get a more nuanced understanding. Even if it doesn't mean that that individual score improves markedly, we have more information with which to make analysis. And we're able to provide more insight to people that are looking at a specific country. So more data, always. Backtesting the stuff that we do have, wherein it comes from regulatory bodies who sometimes do change things from what they've said earlier. And persistence, I think. Keeping at it as we go. I think we've got time for one more quick one, if we have another question. Yes, please, in the very front.
Thank you. My name is Tumen Sugmit. I am representing General Electric in Mongolia. You have shown on the slides that, for example, some provinces, like Maharashtra in Mongolia, they have done much better in promoting green growth. Mm-hmm. So, in your observation, what were the key drivers, for those provinces to perform better in the big countries like India? And then it was, how to say, merit of individuals, provincial leaders, or what is why it happened,
Yeah. It's a very good question. Why do you have such high performance in some particular Indian states and in Chinese provinces or Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region? In these cases, it was largely to do with a very favorable investment framework for large projects, right, for deploying large projects, and that largely comes down to, as you can imagine, land. But also, particularly in the case of the western areas of China, generally robust support for the other infrastructure that you need. So for things like transmission and for things like just the rest of the regulation that's needed to allow deployment to happen. The resources there and further north in Mongolia proper are some of the best in the world, not just for wind, but for solar as well. But it's functionally useless if that generation doesn't actually integrate into the grid, and that requires long-distance bulk transmission, which is either going to be financed by the capital markets or more likely by the government. We hesitate to ascribe too much to any particular person, right? And in fact, it's better that we ascribe it to a policy framework, I think, than to a specific person. But what we found in those, specifically with the Chinese example, is an ongoing commitment to build the rest of that supporting infrastructure. I think there's a sound understanding now of what it takes to build a wind farm or solar park, but the lessons around quickly providing the bulk transmission and further integrating it are very important for these places that are, generally speaking, relatively remote, but have very, very good resources. And I think with that, I'm out of time. I see all sorts of lights flashing at me up here telling me to depart the stage. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you find it useful, and I hope that you'll keep an eye on climate change in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bullard. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure that everyone had a very enjoyable luncheon. So we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to move on to plenary session 2. So ladies and gentlemen, we have refreshments outside in the foyer, and we will see everyone back here at 2 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
아침에